Support independent media and leave the smoldering ruins of corporate idiocy behind with Second Wind logo products from DFTBA. Head on over to shop.secondwindgroup.com for shirts, stickers, and the satisfaction of helping sustain a worker-owned outlet. Plus, we've got cool bird merch, and everyone loves cool birds.
Something interesting has been happening lately with discussions of upcoming video game adaptations. And by interesting, I mean deeply stupid. Back in April, The Ankler ran a story about the restructuring and retooling of Amazon Television. In something of an aside, the report suggested that the upcoming adaptation of the video game Mass Effect was being slightly revised to make it more accessible to, quote, non-gaming audiences. Of course, it very quickly became clear that this was a nothing burger of a story.
Where's the burger? Ah, there she is.
To the point that the writer and executive producer Dan Casey had to take to social media to clarify, quote, "I don't know where that non-gaming audiences quote came from or who said it, but at no point has that been said to me." Something similar happened a bit more recently when Sony premiered the trailer for their upcoming adaptation of Resident Evil from director Zach Kreger. Once again, people got very dumb very quickly, making very silly complaints about how the film was not suitably accurate to the game. Interestingly, and as an aside, one of the things that you notice is that many of the complaints about inaccuracies are themselves inaccurate. So, for example, you got folks complaining that the movie didn't feature Albert Wesker and Leon Kennedy, two Resident Evil characters who have never actually met in the games themselves.
The right to be a god.
No thanks, bro.
But it gets at the level of critique that is happening here. For his part, Kreger has been very candid about his deep and abiding love for Resident Evil as a franchise.
My rule for this movie was to just try and make a movie that felt like my experience of playing the games, that could live in the world of Resident Evil.
That's what we're going to talk about this week. We're going to talk about adaptation, outrage, and where all of this is coming from. And with all that laid out, game on.
How to start? I'm hungry.
One of the things about adaptation from one medium to another is that it is an art form and not a science. Different mediums work in different ways, and the art of translating a work of art across mediums is more than just a direct transposition of material. It's more than just copying and pasting. This has always been true. Consider the long history of adapting books into films. Many of the best films ever are adapted from books, but radically change the source material. Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather is arguably the best film ever made, and it cut a quite literally extended subplot about the size of Sonny's penis. Steven Spielberg's Jaws invented the summer blockbuster, and it completely removes the central interpersonal tension from Peter Benchley's novel, an extramarital affair between Ellen Brody and Hooper. Because, let's face it, in the 1970s, audiences just weren't ready for the raw sexual tension of Richard Dreyfuss. Hell, Stanley Kubrick's The Shining may be the best horror movie ever made, but it so fundamentally alters the source material that writer Stephen King has spent decades trying to overwrite it. In that case, go off, King. These revisions are not small changes to the text. They fundamentally alter the meaning and the substance of the source material. They were also entirely reasonable changes to make in adaptation, and the resulting films have become classics for a reason. These changes are not an act of vandalism. They are instead a mark of respect. They are the product of filmmakers who believe that the source material deserves to be adapted into the best possible film, and understanding that what worked on the page will not always work one for one on screen. The best way to pay respect to a work that you love is not necessarily to adapt it faithfully, but certainly to adapt it well. And with the sportification of media, the tendency in online fandoms is to turn this into a versus match, to suggest that it must be one against the other. Instead, it's entirely possible to love Stephen King's The Shining as a story of a man dealing with his addiction issues and navigating his own self-loathing, while also loving Stanley Kubrick's The Shining as a metaphor for the ghosts haunting the United States of America. Both of these things can be true simultaneously. They can both be great works of art on their own terms. The same is true of video games. Video games are a unique medium, just like films, books, and paintings are also unique mediums. Video games have their own logic and their own mechanics, and the best video games use those to elevate their storytelling in a way that cannot be directly transposed to another medium. It would be insulting to the medium of video games to assume that its best works exist as nothing more than blueprints for excessively faithful film adaptations. The most important thing to remember in adaptation is that the original work will always exist. Kubrick did not go door to door destroying copies of King's beloved novel. It is entirely possible to read and love King's The Shining and to also watch and love Kubrick's The Shining. There can be two cakes. It's worth acknowledging, by the way, just as an aside, that many of the most faithful adaptations are considered among the worst. Gus Van Sant's shot-for-shot remake of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho is a fascinating art house experiment, but a very frustrating narrative film. The quote-unquote live-action, shot-for-shot remakes of the Disney animated classics are an abomination, because the verisimilitudious computer-generated animation will never convey the raw emotion of the hand-drawn animation that it seeks to ape. So, with all that in mind, why do people get so angry about the idea of an adaptation that actually dares to adapt its source material? Part of this is just the reality of modern social media and virality. Studies have consistently shown that anger travels far faster online than other emotions like joy. So if you want to make a YouTube video that goes viral, or even just a hit tweet, it's easier to channel self-righteous anger than it is to be funny or thoughtful.
It's a living.
And this, obviously, goes through cycles. At the moment, it feels worth noting that a lot of grifter culture is facing an existential crisis. The Daily Wire, which is an engine for this sort of nonsense, had to lay off half of its staff a couple of weeks ago, as flagship brand The Ben Shapiro Show saw its viewership plummet by 85% year on year. To be fair, it feels worth acknowledging that the sorts of complaints that underpin a lot of this sort of cultural paranoia, the often baseless fear that some nameless, shapeless other, whether women, people of color, or even just people outside the existing subculture, are coming to take your stuff, so you need to stay angry about it, and you need to stay subscribed, and you need to stay watching, and you maybe need to stay helping them fund that anti-woke Snow White movie, which they're never actually going to make. Also, you know, the anti-woke Sinners starring Jonathan Majors and Zachary Levi as twins, with production picketed by crew following an unsafe stunt, because workplace safety is apparently woke now. Yeah, that's definitely coming out, don't worry about that. The way that people talk about faithfulness and adaptation, one would assume that Zach Cregger will be spending the months leading up to the release of his Resident Evil movie, traveling from house to house, deleting the saved games of Resident Evil 2, and destroying all copies of the original work. It's a very paranoid way of looking at media, assuming that it's a zero-sum game and that a work can only ever exist in one form rather than in multiple formats. It's also a very narrow-minded approach to fidelity, one based in lore and trivia rather than experience. Watching that trailer for Resident Evil, watching Austin Abrams root through drawers looking for weapons and ammunition, I certainly remembered the experience of playing Resident Evil, which is part horror game and part drawer opening simulator. It's clearly Cregger trying to capture the spirit of his experience of the game rather than the letter of Wikipedia. And there's something beautiful in that. I'm gonna talk a little bit about myself here. I don't normally do this in these videos, but it's been a long couple of weeks and this is something that I do actually kinda care about. So, I'm a big comic book nerd. I love comics. I love them so much. I record our fortnightly podcast, The Rewind, in a literal room full of comics. I love them so much that when we get a super chat asking about them, Eric, our wonderful editor, has to put a little timer on me to stop me just going and going and going. But my love of comics didn't originate with comics themselves. By the time I was born, comic book distributors had embraced the direct market. Comics weren't being sold in places accessible to a young kid like me. I remember it being a minor miracle when my mum found an issue of Doug Munch and Kelly Jones' Batman in the local grocery store in Ghana. I still remember that story with Swamp Thing and Killer Croc so much. I also remember finding one issue of Alan Grant's Shadow of the Bat that was a quasi-sequel to Alan Moore and Brian Boland's... Look, that's not important now. Instead, the important thing is that I came to comic books through the adaptations of the 1990s. Movies like Tim Burton's Batman and especially Batman Returns, or Sam Raimi's Spider-Man and especially Spider-Man 2. These were adaptations that took huge liberties with the source material. The casting of Michael Keaton as Batman was hugely controversial at the time, as were the revisions to the lore and the backstory. However, these films, which were truly cinematic adaptations drawing from German expressionist cinema and from classic monster movies, ignited curiosity and an interest in me that brought me to comics as a medium themselves. I love comics, and I love movies. I love comics because they do things that movies can't do. I love movies because they do things that comics can't do. I don't need one to be a photocopy of the other, because that would mean diminishing what makes each medium great in its own terms. There is something magical in getting to share some part of something that you love with other people, and in meeting those people at least halfway to where they are. One does not diminish the other. Art is the rare thing that doesn't get smaller when you share it with others. It gets so much bigger. And I think that's pretty great. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was The Backdrop.